Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode I'm going to be talking to Douglas Lain about science fiction and revolution. So Douglas Lain is the author of numerous books and science fiction books, such as Billy Moon, After the Saucers Landed, and Bash Bash Revolution. He is also the writer of a collection of short stories entitled Last Week's Apocalypse, and he is also the editor of numerous volumes of short stories as well. He's probably best known as a YouTuber and podcaster. So he is the former freelancer who worked without a contract as a publisher, publicist, and YouTuber for Zero Books. And so Zero Books has been going through a number of changes right now. And so he is currently rebranding and working on a book publishing company and media company of his own. The session was recorded before many of these changes took place. So it was recorded on the 24th of August 2021 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, who meet regularly to explore ideas relating to avant-garde art, radical counterculture, and other areas and disciplines that we see as relevant to our explorations. The sessions are free and open to everyone, so if you want to get involved, they're currently on hiatus, but they'll be up and running again soon. If you want to get involved, send me a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com or check out our website, which is www.explodingappendix.com, or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Thanks to Doug for coming. I originally entitled this session Science Fiction and Revolution. So I also know that some of the anthologies also refer to your work or refer to the writings as speculative fiction. So sort of what genre do you see yourself working within when you're writing sort of fiction, and how do you understand that genre?
Well, in the early 2000s, there was a short-lived movement of writers that labeled themselves as slipstream. And I kind of identified with that label. Although when there were anthologies, none of my fiction got selected. So, bitterly, I only rarely use it now. But slipstream is sort of science fiction or fantasy that aims at bringing values from the literature broadly into science fiction. It's not only about ideas, but it's about styles and characterization and even experimentation. Each book that I've written, I think each novel is different in terms of its genre. Like Billy Moon, which is the only book you didn't hold up, which was the book about May 1968 and Christopher Robin, was more of a surrealist or magical realist book, fantasy. And that didn't have a core science fiction idea. Then, of course, After the Saucers Landed is a science fiction book, but it's probably more experimental than your typical science fiction book would be. So people who are really heavily into the science fiction genre and like hard SF would pick up After the Saucers Landed and maybe not love it. In fact, a couple of reviewers said things like, "This is more like a college thesis or something than a novel." And Bash Bash Revolution, I think, is like probably my most conventional novel in the genre of like contemporary. It even was cast as young adult fiction, which I didn't really intend to write a young adult novel, but I could see why it had a teenage protagonist and it was marketed that way. Overall, I try to hold with like Philip K. Dick's definition of science fiction as a literature of ideas and wrestling with modernity. So unlike just literary stories that really focus on the psychology of characters and more mundane stories, the nice thing about science fiction or fantasy even is that you can explore philosophical ideas. You can explore bigger concepts and social concepts, rather than just the stories of individuals' lives. And I often think of myself as a science fiction writer who doesn't know anything about science, but turns to critical theory to be the background of my, the science of my fiction, which is, kind of ludicrous, but also somewhat true. So that's how I would characterize what I'm doing. Although, I would love to write like a detective story sometime. Like, I'd like to just branch out away from science fiction eventually, because I feel like as a writer, it's good to go, to test your chops, to do things that you haven't done before.
Well, I can imagine you just being able to take the similar kind of way of writing and go into any kind of genre, really. It just so happens that it kind of works in science fiction. But, there's that sort of philosophical, reflective ability to humor, kind of any genre, really, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope so. I'm going to see what I can do next.
Yeah.
It's been a little while.
So I'm sort of primarily familiar with your work through your podcasting. So your primary podcast is Zero Squared. And before that, you had Diet Soap. You also do Pop the Left with C. Derek Varn. So Zero Squared has been important, at least in my mind, in terms of like developing a kind of Marxist kind of political philosophy, or almost a kind of Marxist political philosophy that is sort of relevant to the contemporary world, but can also be very critical of current leftist discourse and practices, especially around issues around strategy, free speech, identity politics. And Pop the Left, I just find really useful in terms of like learning about sort of Marxist and other sort of left political thought and history. And I suppose it's sort of certainly true that your science fiction books tend to explore similar political and philosophical themes, yet they sort of tend to it seems that they're quite separate projects from your podcasts and publishing work. So how continuous or separate do you see these two projects?
Well, I see them as being informed by I see my fiction writing, which came first, as being informed by the podcasting and then now the work that I do for Zero Books. But the approach is very, very different. But, After the Saucers Landed is a book that was very much informed by my development or working through an attempt at an understanding of Zizekian thought and wrestling with ideological criticism and theory. And Batch Revolution was my attempt to think through what it would take to replace commodity production, amongst other things. But it was very much about what would it take to really overcome capitalism. And I also wanted to do it without telling the story of a working class revolution. Perversely, maybe, or maybe that just demonstrates my ultimately bourgeois sensibilities. But I just felt that the realism and the slog and the tedium of long-term strategic activist and working class party building and the struggle that would be necessary wouldn't make an interesting science fiction novel. So I introduced the AI to kind of do the work that people would have to do through building a political project. But the end result, I hoped, would be some sort of technological and social arrangement that could operate instead of the commodity production capitalism. And so that's the thing about Batch Revolution that I like the most, is the fact that I think that I get at how to replace commodity production, and I've written it as a dystopian story. Um, and not like a terrible dystopia, not like 1984, but just like I've included some of the things that might be lost in the process of getting beyond the current moment. And maybe not all of them would be lost, but the fears that people might have about living in a communist society, like a fully automated gay luxury communist society. What would we lose in that in under that kind of system? So I do see a connection, but obviously I have more freedom and of expression when I'm writing fiction, and I also have a lot. There are other concerns other than just the thinking and the theory and that come forward, like how do you create relatable characters? How do you create a plot that will drive people along? Which I enjoy that part of it as much as anything else, really.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's not just like reading a kind of philosophical essay. There's a lot of fun and play and exploration and narrative and character. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that. I suppose that one of the things that does make those two projects quite similar is they both share some sort of ambivalences around, like the fact that it's a dystopian novel. Both your podcast and your science fiction writing have these kind of ambivalences around politics, which you're in favour of, but it seems like there's an ambivalence around them.
Right. Well, again, to talk about a book that we won't talk about very much, the novel Billy Moon's point was to see if I could redeem May of 1968 in the eyes of Christopher Robin Milne. And Christopher Robin Milne, I read his biographies, and he was a very practical liberal, and who strove after having a mature and meaningful life. He was a naturist. He sold books for a living, and he kind of resented the way that his father created a character that was associated with him. That he was, especially as a young man, he had to work to escape his fictional reputation, and I felt that the people on strike in May of '68, the workers and students, were juvenile or immature in a way that Christopher Robin, who would have been around, it was like 38 or something at the time, would have felt some disdain towards them. That he would not have appreciated that. But I wanted to see if I could think through May of '68 and find what was serious about it and find what was redeemable about it, because I really did feel like it was when I wrote the book that it was one of the last moments in the West where we had a potential for a revolutionary change. I may be more cynical now than I was then, but that's what the aim was. So the ambivalence, I feel like you have to be critical, and that means being ambivalent and not too quick to celebrate the strategies and values of the contemporary left in order to be serious, because we've had so much failure, for a couple centuries that we need. And I don't know, maybe there's a bit of Jordan Peterson in me too. Like, life is hard. Like, we're not going to just deliver utopia here. We're going to have to deal with the unpleasant sides of human nature, or our own existence, existential problems. And so I want to include that part in my thinking in the work that I do.
From the perspective of a political podcaster who often engages in Marxist political thought, what does sort of Marxism mean to you, and how does Marxism relate to ideas of revolution? We actually talked about this before.
We talked about this question before we started, and I said that's the toughest one you asked, but it seems like it's the simplest one. Well, Marxism is a very broad and multifaceted project that arose out of the writings of Marx and also out of the struggles for revolution in the 19th century. The communist project, the First International, the revolution of 1848. All of this is informing what Marxism became. And Marxism is something that I think of as having that basically, you talk about ambivalence. Like, I think being ambivalent about Marxism is like absolutely necessary. Like being critical, not being trying to be as clear as you can be, not reading Marxists as if they are going to deliver the final word as they critique society, and not reading Marxists as if they somehow stand outside of society and are delivering a judgment of it from a higher plane. They whether it's a moral plane or technical plane or what have you. I think the Marxist insights, some of them, such as that the way that we reproduce ourselves, produce the world that we live in socially, informs and directs the kinds of people that we are. So that you're going to be a different kind of person if you're living in a feudal society and living off of subsistence farming than you would be if you're a worker in 20th century England, working in a factory and struggling to get a paycheck to survive. It's just, you're going to be a different kind of person. And the people who run those systems will be different, and the ways of thinking about the world will be different because of the material conditions changing. So like that insight, I think, is one of the key insights to Marx, is that, and that's one of the things I keep driving home, that I can just repeat indefinitely. I think that it's not that Marx is not about changing our individual consciousness. It's not even primarily about changing the ideology of society or making people be more aware of their privileges or of the inequities in the world. Like Marxism is about empowering humanity to take responsibility for itself. And the way it does that is by trying to critique the society as it is and point out how the social relations that reproduce the world create our society. And that gives us a chance to change those social relations, to change our material conditions by reorganizing and rethinking how we work together. So it's not a moral critique primarily, although there's obviously moral components to it, but it's a materialist, philosophical, social critique and political critique of society. And now, so did you ask the question, like, what do we do with that to create a politics out of it?
I guess that's the way you can interpret that question.
Yeah, because there's a very there's a very big problem for me. Like, I don't, and not just for me, but I don't think that there's been a viable Marxist political project for quite a while. Like there's been struggles to create them. And there have been moments where the beginning of the glimmer of the need, like an understanding of the need for such a thing has come up. Like in Occupy Wall Street would be an example. Even recently, the George Floyd protests brought that need for a deep critique of capitalism and a change on the level of that, on the level of how we work together to reproduce ourselves. That came forward, but that is just the bare beginnings of a political project, and a real political project didn't come out of the George Floyd protests. It didn't come out of Occupy Wall Street. It didn't even really come out of a Marxist one. Didn't even come out of May '68. So I think that part of the Marxist project now has to be, just like it was after World War II, re-examining the history and trying to discover some of the mistakes that were made, and also how those mistakes are replicated and even get maybe worse over time. So that my answer is, I don't have the answer to that question.
So your novel, After the Saucers Landed, It's written in 2015, but it's set in an alternative version of the 1990s, where aliens have invaded, bringing with them all the kind of B-movie kitsch that's often associated with them. The story follows two UFOologists, Harold Flint, a Fluxus artist, who's been using happenings to explore alien abduction, and Brian Johnson, a writer and English professor. And the sort of book weaves through a plethora of references to UFOlogy, happenings, Fluxus, Black Mountain College, Buckminster Fuller, avant-garde art, Yoko Ono, John Cage, Kurt Vonnegut, suprematists, George Bush Sr., Bill Clinton, René Descartes, Bertolt Brecht, and films like The Angry Red Planet, Plan 9 from Outer Space, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and Planet of the Apes. So it's a book that sort of synthesizes lots of popular culture and reflects on it and analyzes it. And it uses that in a way to create its own kind of world. But it's a kind of world that's chock full of references. So why were these kind of references important to you, and how do you sort of use them to help to sort of create this world?
Well, I think that this is something that I can't avoid. I think that maybe if I was not a TV baby, if I had been raised in a different environment, I would, and maybe a more literate one, I would still have references, but it wouldn't be to pop culture. It would be to great books or something. But like, I find, like, I'm in therapy these days for the first time in my adult life. I'm in therapy, and I go into my therapist and I say, what's going on in my life is like this scene from The Good Place, so like I interpret the world through this network of popular culture or references, just naturally. And then I hope that when I write about this in a more conscious way, that I can be more selective than I might be in a therapy session, and also that I can not do it gratuitously, like always have a purpose behind doing it. One of the things that I worry about, especially now that I'm turned 50, is that all my references are like so dated now. Like, oh yeah, he uses pop culture a lot, but pop culture from like the 1980s and 90s. Now that's one of the reasons why I maybe said it back in the 90s, is to have the excuse to do that. The other thing though is for that book particularly, but also for like Billy Moon, it gave me an excuse to explore parts of popular culture that I didn't know about before. Like, in order to ground the novel set in Paris in May of 1968 in something that I thought was sensibility that would reflect the time, like I started listening to like Yee Yee girl music and reading old newspapers and comic strips, and trying to place myself in the popular culture of France in May of 68 and earlier. I talked to a Frenchman about this, a guy who lives in Paris, actually a friend of the family. I said, so how'd I do? And he said, oh, it's terribly American, nothing like France. You completely missed the boat. Like, oh, well. But yeah, so I do think we live in a world dominated by popular culture still. And what also has happened is that for younger people, like my kids who are Zoomers, it's a world dominated by popular culture, which is so niche that it makes it difficult for people to talk to people even down the road, or like when I was in high school, everybody had a little clique, but there was an overall, like, there was 4 networks and everyone knew it was on NBC that night, right? But now you could share nothing culturally with the guy whose locker is next to you. Like, you don't know the same YouTubers, you don't go to the same websites, that kind of thing. So
there's also a sort of sense that things are in a way like you can be interested in, you can easily listen to music from any kind of era, or you could watch films from any, there's in a way that sort of in some ways mirrors your books, because we are in a kind of age where everything seems on hand from the past as well. It's like everything's mixed and matched together.
Yeah, that's right too. So I was kind of capturing that experience as well, and particularly in that book where there are lots of doppelgangers, and the aliens. What the aliens do is they come down, and they will, in order to start the abduction process, if I'm remembering this correctly, they will have personalities swap. So, you're Bradley Tuck, I'm Doug Lain. The alien comes into the room. Now, rather than you and I switching bodies, we'll switch personalities. So I'd put on your outfit and you'd put on mine, and you'd go home to my house and I'd go to your house, and no one would notice the difference because our personalities, which are just a bunch of, like, it's all performative, right? It would actually swap, and the bodies don't matter. It's this sort of essence of cultural ephemera that creates a personality. And the ultimate aim of the aliens is to strip that all away as it goes along, and to make the main character has a realization about his own identity and the fictional nature of it as it goes along. So
yeah, so maybe I'll jump onto a question a bit later, because I think that it sort of responds to that. After the Sources Landed is a book with lots of doppelgangers, body swapping, and identity crisis. And these identity crises bring up sort of issues of political alienation, philosophical issues around the self and the mind-body problem, and I suppose aesthetic issues around the avant-garde destabilization of aesthetic devices. How should we think about the ways these different destabilizations of the self overlap?
Well, I don't know. There's a way that the novel thinks about it, I suppose, which I'm not sure I'm actually really happy with in the end. But and then there was a way that I might think about it now. One of the things, I guess, maybe both the novel and me today would say, that I would say now, is that despite the fact that our identities are unstable, and despite the fact that you can't find an art form, for instance, that will hold up, always hold up under, in different contexts. I mean, really great art, I guess, would its meaning would change, and it would still be relevant even as the culture around it changed and the context for its appearance changed. But even though these things are unstable and ultimately fictional, they are significant. And I think what I was aiming at in that book to get at was that there's a subjectivity which doesn't actually have any particular form, but in sort of purely negative, which nonetheless makes us responsible for creating these identities and taking responsibility for them, and being as loyal as we can be to the people that we try to become, so that we, even though underneath the surface, all the Gen X trappings that I might try to surround myself with don't actually give me a fixed identity. It's not solid. Nonetheless, like, I have a subjectivity which has to take responsibility for the life that I've led up to this point. And if I want to change it, it should be through that, through the choices that I already made, and through the realization, most of all, of my own responsibility for the changes that I might make.
So do you think sort of responsibility is quite a key element in your thinking about identity?
Yeah, but it's not like where I'm at right now. I might emphasize the like in a patriarchal way. We have to take responsibilities for ourselves, pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, and that kind of thing. And I don't quite mean it that way, because it's also the fact that we're responsible for who we are means that we're free as well. That we can't be free without taking that responsibility, without being, and also without recognizing that the limits that what we're going to be picking and the ways we choose to change who we are, that we're going to be responsible for will always be picked up as limits on ourselves, as new kinds of limits. And that doesn't mean that we get smaller and smaller and we have more and more constrained. It's that we will be changing one set of limitations for others. We'll be shifting from one definition of who we are to another, but it's not as though we can skip the process of our responsibility and the kind of fictional nature of identity and find who we really are, and then be free by being aligned with something other than our own kind of negative self, our own responsibility. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, well, I think there's something to be said about the idea that responsibility, that it's not just that with freedom comes with responsibility, but also with responsibility comes freedom. It's quite a nice way of reversing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. If you're taking responsibility for your life, then you are free to make changes, and if you aren't taking any responsibility, then you're just the object of forces beyond your control that you don't claim as something that you can influence or alter.
So there's a lot of moments within the book that seem quite cynical about art and the power of art. So at one moment, it says that Harold's art, the whole movement, has, and he's talking here about sort of fluxes and things and stuff, has traded on nostalgia and absurdity. But now that something real is going on, now that the sources have landed, all he's got is a can of artist's shit and an alarm clock. And at another point, Brian says, the arts and crafts movement might not have produced a socialist utopia, but they know how to make a good chair, or they know how to.
You know how to make a good chair. That's good.
Yes, yeah. That's what I'm trying
Correct.
to say.
I may have had a typo there. You should fix it for me. But yeah.
But I might have had a typo there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
sort of see as that.
Okay. Well, Brian is a cynical character too, right? And he's feeling lost. So you can't take what he says there as my ultimate judgment on arts and crafts, and although you might, but then even if you do that, that doesn't mean I'm right, or it's like something I would necessarily defend. But if I remember correctly about my own book, there is more about the alarm clock and the problem of creating a time. The alarm clock had a different set of digits, right? It wasn't 12, it was 13 or something, right? And
I think it's 10. It was 10.
It was a 10. Okay, it was 10. Yeah. And what Brian notices, again, it's been a while since I wrote the book and reread it. What Brian notices is that by changing the number of digits on the alarm clock, the aim was to break from linear time, to question linear time, but linear time was actually something that the alarm clock was merely measuring, that was actually really existed as a social force, that you couldn't simply conceptually break from linear time, and that maybe it would be useful to start there, but that those alarm clocks with the 10 digits the other option is that we just measure time differently, in which case the problem of linear time wouldn't disappear, right? It would just be, it's different set of units. But the aim of Fluxus was to like break free from the constraints of social reality. And the assumption was in those kinds of works that the conceptual break would be enough. And because there was something else maybe backing it, that reality as it really wasn't constrained by concepts like that, and the concepts which arise from the social material production. So Brian was noticing that the Fluxus, the limits of Fluxus as a philosophy, in that section. But he was also really mad at his mentor and hated the almost as much as Harry Flynn. I think Brian didn't really like the aesthetic of these B-movie aliens either.
Yeah.
So yeah.
There's also a bit in the novel where I think Brian says something about, couldn't we just tell everybody about what the aliens are really doing? And that almost sort of seems to go nowhere, because it almost seems like, how possible is it to just sort of reveal what the aliens are actually up to?
Right. Well, the people who, I mean, yeah, who are you? How do you know who you're telling is not already an alien? And also, how do you and how do you know that even if they aren't, that they won't be tomorrow or in 10 minutes? Or it's like the president of the United States swapped places with the head alien, right? It's just everything goes wrong right away once the aliens land.
Yeah, and it's also a book where it sort of gradually everything just sort of destabilizes in the novel itself.
Yeah, I tell you, writing it was a headache. Trying to keep track of just what the logic of my body swapping thing was, and make it consistent. It was like, have I done that? Oh, maybe I haven't. Do a little bit of hand waving. Talk about a clock again. So keep people from thinking too hard about this part. Yeah.
Well, there's moments where you end up having to say it's one person, and then you're also saying it's also that could it be this person and this person that we're talking about. Right. Layers of who it could actually be.
Right.
So Bash Revolution, which was your 2018 novel, takes place in an alternative 2017, in a world where gaming through augmented reality is increasingly taking over, whilst a renewed Cold War between Trump and Putin threatens nuclear destruction. The book explores tech utopianism, revolution, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, gaming, and could be said to explore what a future revolution might look like. However, rather than as in Marxism, where the worker is a kind of revolutionary subject or driving force of history, rather than the worker, it's the artificial intelligence itself that is the sort of driving force of history. To what extent does artificial intelligence threaten to sort of replace the worker as the sort of central engine of history? Or to put it another way, does the worker have a role in the future of revolutions?
Well, okay. I think there are those two questions might seem like they're the same, but they're different, right? The question is, to what extent does the artificial intelligence threaten to replace the worker?
Yeah.
Could be recast as, to what extent can the working class abolish itself and use the general intellect to create conditions where people don't have to sell their labor power on the market to survive?
Yeah.
Right. And I tend to think that what I tried to point out in the novel Bash Revolution in a lighthearted way, without getting too far into the weeds, was that simply having artificial and AI and having a lot of technical mastery and knowing where every part of society was and how it was functioning wouldn't be enough to get beyond commodity production and the sale of labor power. And that what really created the conditions where capitalism could be overcome was finding another mediating structure for human activity. So another way for people to congregate together and and work and play together, and have a new teleological aim, right? And the aim was, in my humorous science fiction novel, to play video games, to become, different people based on the games you were playing, and to produce a world not with the aim of expanding value, but with the aim of expanding the range of games that were possible, and and meeting the needs at the beginning of the kinds of demographic characters that existed. So you had to create games for every type of person, or every broad generalization about the type of people that were out there. And like my favorite section on that would be the game where you get to revisit the 90s and be a young Gen Xer again in virtual reality, and the mother character is enraptured by that prospect. So the dream of the novel is that that the technology we create could be used to replace commodity production. But I'll keep answering for everybody. But the other question is, can we get there without a working class movement of self-emancipation and self-abolition? I think the answer would be no. I think that the process that I set up in the novel, the way fully automated gay luxury communism arrives, it was fanciful. It was a science fiction novel. That wouldn't really work. But yeah, so that's my answer.
Yes, it's almost like there's certain type of because we've interviewed Richard Barber before, and back along the Californian ideology. So you get that kind of approach where the worker is effectively taken out of the equation. It's kind of utopian.
Well, the thing about the California ideology is that it doesn't eliminate the worker. It doesn't overcome the worker. It just offers, participation and precarity in combination as as an ideological screen through which, you can continue to be working class without noticing.
Yeah.
No.
In Bash Revolution, Bucky, which is the AI, says humans want to fix the world without changing it. That can't be done. At another point in the book, Matthew says of his dad, the creator of Bucky, that my dad has been in a race against stupidity, but he has lost. What he didn't understand is that the very tools that he'd used to help his side, the very computational powers he thought made it inevitable that his side would win, were precisely why people were so disengaged, so alienated, so ready to accept one blunder and atrocity after another. To what extent should we see sort of tech or AI solutions as better or worse than sort of humans, and when it comes to thinking through sort of structural problems and solutions?
Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of trickier than maybe it seems. The race against stupidity in the first, let me look at, you wrote this down. I'm going to look at the first part again. Yeah, wanting to fix the world without changing it. So, right. I mean, in the book, they go through all these possible ways of trying to escape from their fate of, nuclear annihilation. Like, how can we make this world operate so that we don't destroy ourselves? And every fix that they try to implement has to do with making them institutions and figures within those institutions better, perfecting the people, perfecting the institutions. What if we made Trump smarter and less of a sociopath? That's one thing that they entertain, like through using nanobots or really good therapy or something. And the answer to that is, if he was more competent, smarter, and less psychological damage, the nuclear Armageddon would come even faster, right? The thing that the AI notices is that it's the smooth functioning of the system that is creating the problem that's setting us off on this path of destruction. And so, again, with like all the computational power that his father's working to create, the AI systems and the instruments to perfect society, only creates stupidity and alienation, because it's perfecting a particular kind of social relationship which has this effect of creating alienation. It's not the technology that's doing it. It's the way the technology is implemented to perfect and make more efficient a system which, when functioning well, creates alienation, disassociation, and conflict. So it's that's the point. It's that it's the world as we have built it, the world as we reproduce it, the social aims that we use in order to sustain ourselves inevitably lead us into conflict and contradiction and problems. So doing that in a more intelligent way will only make the process of contradiction and conflict arrive faster and more, it'll just make everything fall apart, more efficiently, and that's the point there. But I don't think that doesn't make me anti-tech. It just means that we need a new aim. And that, again, in Fast Revolution, the aim was playing video games, which, it's a silly suggestion, but it's what makes the novel work.
Well, this sort of leads me on to my next question, because the video games, or at a certain point, the video games relate to this is related to this idea of the situationist understanding of art. So the situationist attempt to transcend the commodity form and the spectacle, and transform art into reality and reality into art, and that's sort of interpreted through the lens of video games and augmented reality. But what strikes me as ambiguous in the book is whether this is the radical ideas of the situationist, or what's going on in the book, and the revolution within the book is the radical ideas of the situationist international realized, or whether this augmented reality is really just a sort of even more totalized spectacle.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I, was a young man, encountered the Society of Spectacle and the ideas of the Situationist International, and like that defined my left politics for, a decade or more. Like that, I thought this was the most radical group that had ever come to be, and that their ideas were worth understanding thoroughly. And I spent time trying to avoid being pro situ, right? Like I knew that there were dangers. Like I was deep enough in it, like I cared about whether I was a Trekkie or a Trekker in terms of situationist, right? I'm not pro situationist, I'm a situationist. That matters, like these little nuances. But as I actually started to read Marx and Hegel and look into the history of that was informing what they did, the kind of this anti-Bolshevik Marxism, and read the ideas of Cornelius Castoriadis and Socialism or Barbarism, the journal that Gita Board came out of. I became more critical of the idea of the spectacle, primarily because, like everyone else after World War II, the board was working on the assumption that the state and that the managing class had overcome the kind of economic and material contradictions that Marx had described in the 19th century. That now, the market wasn't in charge, the state was, the managers were. Everything was going to be rational. And it wasn't like Marcuse thought this was a terrible predicament because it was a rational continuation of the exploitation of the workers, but not when he talked about exploitation. It was sometimes unclear whether he was talking about suppression and oppression and diminishment of creativity, or whether he was talking about exploitation in the strictly economic Marxist terms of the kind of exploitation that comes through creating commodities that have a value based on labor time. And I think that Guy Debord was aiming at the spectacle as what he was critiquing, because he thought that was the ideological structure that allowed for hierarchical relations and a similar working class exploitation, the way like Marcuse would describe it, to continue. Whereas I think that if we had actually arrived at a point where the spectacle was setting up the terms of our productive life, it would be a lot closer to what they also claim to want, which is that everyday life would become art and everyday life would become some sort of creative expression. I think there was a feeling that somewhere in the situationists thought that there was a way of being in the world which was authentic, that was direct, that wouldn't have these limits on it, and wouldn't be. I think alienation from the world is just built in if you have a human subject, if you have society and subjectivity. And the question is, what form of alienation, on what basis, with what aims? And so I would say if we lived in a society of spectacle, that would be a kind of weird socialism, and not capitalism, and not a world based on commodity production, because it would be based on human desire, it'd be based on human culture, and not on an abstract material force that's outside of anyone's real interests.
Well, it's almost like sort of Debord and Marcuse are really responding to sort of, to some extent, largely the post-war welfare state.
Yeah,
and sort of
and the economic boom that followed the Depression, and the sense and American consumerism, and the Soviet Union,
yes,
and all of it, and like if you look to something like the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964, like they are protesting against labor unions and bureaucracy and the state, and the feeling that their personal lives and their ambitions are being thwarted by a massive societal structure. And they're not protesting against they're not Marxist in that moment for the most part, and in 68 in Paris, there was more of an understanding of the need to overcome capitalist relations amongst some, but even there it was, the most radical students were situationists. They were thinking about these things in ideological terms.
Well, you can imagine there is a sort of parallel between the situationists' idea of everyone becoming kind of artists and Thatcher's idea of everyone becoming entrepreneurs, and that sort of. I mean, is that like the?
Yeah, so right. I mean, the neoliberal answer to the demand for more authentic lives of participation where we can be self-directed is exactly that. Everyone's their own entrepreneur, which, by the way, is that's what I am.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm a freelance publisher. I have a gig, but and a large part of my time is spent doing things like this, where I'm branding myself, making myself continually relevant. It might be nice to be 50 and to be able to say I have a job and a pension, and I don't have to worry about appearing hip for the kids anymore. Right? Although, I mean, I think I'm egocentric enough that I wouldn't do that, but nonetheless, like I like trying to, I admired William Burroughs as a young person. It's like, wow, he got to be into his 80s and still had things to say that were relevant to the culture. I think that's worth, aiming at. But nonetheless, yeah, I mean, there is a neoliberal version of the 68 dream, and it arrived.
Yeah. And so this is actually my final question. So the book takes place in an alternative 2017. but a very different one from the one that we're familiar with. So there's lots of references that seem sort of better suited in other eras, and even things from contemporary culture seem displaced or almost nostalgic. Do you see this book as somehow engaged with the contemporary world? And what do you see the sort of significance of that particular date?
Well, truth is, I wrote it in 2017.
Mm.
So it was the present
Yeah.
that I was writing about. Yeah, as far as everything seeming nostalgic, I mean, it combines. Bash Bash Revolution is actually about Super Smash Brothers Brawl, right? Or Super Smash Brothers Melee is really what Bash Bash Revolution is in the book, which is already an old video game, but it was one that people were still playing and still are playing, like in tournaments. This is a tough question. I think I am just have a nostalgic sensibility, and I don't know. Maybe taking that perspective on even the recent past is one way I try to remain critically engaged in my life, rather than swept along by it. Like I remember being like 19, the summer between my senior year of high school and or maybe I was 18 and college, and going on a road trip with some friends and recognizing this is a moment I will be nostalgic for. Like this is I'm already nostalgic for the things that I'm going to do in about an hour. I've been interested in this idea of a nostalgia for the present for a while too.
Yeah.
And I guess it speaks to my own alienation, but I think that alienation has a double edge to it. Like on the one hand, it keeps me from being as enmeshed in the moment as I might be and enjoying it as much as I might, like Adorno said, someone who says that he's happy is always lying, because in order to say that you're happy, you have to step out of your happiness and outside of your experience and judge it. So I'm always a person who's saying, am I happy? But on the other side of it, it does give me an ability to try to interpret, and as we said earlier in the conversation, try to interpret always through dated pop cultural references that get more and more dated every day. but yeah.
Yeah, but for example, I hadn't heard of turf bangs until I'd read this book.
Oh yeah, that's something I picked up from my daughter, who had bangs and was called a turf by a friend of hers on Twitter or Instagram or something.
No, I did actually have to look to see actually what is this. Yeah.
I have no idea why a haircut could be associated with that, with whatever a turf means. I guess trans exclusionary radical feminist, but it seems to mean much more than that now.
Yeah.
But right. And that's one of those references that probably has fallen out of fashion and is already people might be weirdly nostalgic for, or have to remember, but is also seemingly to me like really contemporary, like almost like turf bangs. To understand what turf bangs are, you have to understand quite a lot about internet culture and all the wars that are going on and so forth.
Well, Neil's putting up a picture. Is that Spock?
It does look a bit like Spock. I don't think Spock is a turf, but I do think those turfs do look like Spock.
Yeah. Does anyone know why those bangs got associated with turfs? Was there like a famous feminist who had those bangs who said, turfy things, and that's why? Or
I think. Well, I did see some articles with some examples where it did sort of go through some, because I did look it up after I read that section, and there were they did sort of say there were sort of examples where someone had said something or this. It was.
I also associate that look, those bangs, with 30s style movie stars or something. There's a certain I can imagine someone in a noir film, a woman like femme fatale in a noir film having Spock bangs. know, or good things. So maybe that's what it is there's a conservative choice being made when you do that look. Like I'm throwing back to some sort of traditional femininity when I
maybe it's, I almost feel like it maybe isn't. It's maybe, is it the opposite? Like it's almost a
masculine.
no, it's almost like it's sort of like a kind of trendy, probably sort of 90s trend, or like maybe no,
late 2000s.
late 2000s trendy. Oh, look.
I know because I had one. Can I ask a question, Brad? I think you said.
Yeah, I think it's open. Well, it's always open, but
so forgive me, Doug, I'm so sorry, but so I'm going to focus on kind of some of the last things we've talked about, just so I can, my brain can extend back that far. When you've said a few times you're approaching 50, so you're a Gen Xer, I guess.
Yeah, I am 50 on the dot. I'm not approaching it. I'm at it. It's very sad. Go on.
Well, I know, not really. I mean, I find Gen X really fascinating. My mum is one. She was a very young mum, and I find when she talks about Gen X, I mean, I don't want to do any stereotypes here, but I'm also kind of so exhausted. I'm not sure that I'm going to give many concrete examples. But when my mum talks about Gen X in the 80s, what I feel about the 80s is it's funny that you're talking about nostalgia, because I sense so much nostalgia in Gen X for the 80s, but not just because everybody is nostalgic about the decade in which they had their adolescence, but also because Gen X was, the 80s seems to me, when I'm listening to my mum talk about it, my father's older, his decade was the 70s. And that kind of 80s culture seems to me to be the kind of, maybe the first time that there was a separation from following in the same route as your parents, as we kind of begin to see in the 70s. But with that separation having a really interesting mix of tons of mass-produced things, you know, Coke and MTV and trainers and sneakers. And so the nostalgia for the object of things such as video games, such as, you know, drinking Cokes with your friends, having the best kind of sneakers, having the first SNES, or, you know, I think that's like really theme I really see in Gen X often.
Yeah, you know, I don't. Oh, I'm hearing my echo. Okay, I two things about Gen X. The first thing to realize is that the term was coined in the 50s. So the Gen X that arose then was the children of after the Second World War, not the people who fought in it, but the children. And they're not boomers, right? They were born during the war. And they were the lost generation, or they were Gen X, and they didn't have confidence in their culture, and they were all about personal expression. And, you know, it's interesting to see the original context for Gen X and how it arose. I think this idea of each generation being cut off from the tradition that they were born into and having to create their own way or their own culture, it probably is a post-World War II phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like the term teenager arose in the late 40s. And so like boomers were from my perspective, and this may be myopic and maybe even earlier than this, but the boomers were the generation that got nostalgic for their own adolescence first and had it marketed back to them. Like you look at American Graffiti as an example of that kind of product, where in the 70s, you look back 20 years to the 50s, so one of the things about Gen X that we were supposed to be breaking free from was precisely that kind of life where your past could be marketed back to you. Yeah. We were supposed to be, you know, brought up on television and computers and media savvy just by the era in which we were born, and therefore immune from the manipulation of marketers, immune from this sort of sentimentalism. And I think the 80s, to be nostalgic for the 80s, is a really neat trick. When we're talking about Reaganism, the dismantling of the welfare state, the Contras, the last hiccup of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. I mean, I was a kid that thought that I could be destroyed in a fireball any day.
Cold
Like,
War,
you know, yeah. And I thought it, but I think the way I felt about it was different than kids who would have been my age in the 60s and really facing it much more directly. Like, it was actually more of a living possibility then than it was under Reagan. But nonetheless, you know, I watched The Day After on TV. I went around when I was in elementary school trying to get everyone to sign a petition that I hadn't even written up yet, but so it was like a blank piece of paper. But I was like, sign this petition to advocate for a nuclear freeze and dismantling of nuclear bombs. So to be nostalgic for that time is a neat trick. And yet it works, and even on me more and more as I get older. So and I think maybe the thing that I think might get forgotten as we try to resist that kind of nostalgia is how this generational politics and the idea that each generation makes its own youth culture and as different from what came before. There's a hidden promise there, this sort of utopian promise that you can't change the world. Like every generation has a terrible burden to be the revolutionary generation, the generation that fixes things. And the left does this as much as anyone. Like, well, the millennials are here. The millennial left. What are they going to do it? Are they going to make the change? Oh no, they didn't do it. Okay, well, here come the Zoomers. You know, they can do it. They'll have a different mentality. They'll be more radical because why? Well, who knows? But but as wrong-headed as it is to think that each generation is really going to break from what came before, especially considering how similar the youth cultures are from one generation to the next. It also does have this sort of recognition in it of the need for change. Like the fact that it shows that we're not very hopeful as a culture and haven't been for a long, long time about our future, like probably since the First World War. Yeah, that'd be my answer to that. I don't know if I really answered your question or not, but
it's interesting. I mean, do you find that there has been an acceleration? Because I mean, my father says that a lot. You know, he says that, well, he's Irish as well, which gives a very specific context, I think. But like, he says that, you know, just in seeing his kind of grandparents, great grandparents, parents' time, you know, the kind of acceleration of the separation between youth and tradition has kind of accelerated from the 60s to now. The thing that I find kind of mind-blowing, and I mean, I can relate a lot to Gen X, you know, I mean, I was born in the late 80s, you know, it's not like I was born in 2005. The thing that I find really strange about Gen Z, apart from that they sometimes seem like an alt-right fever dream, is that like, I shouldn't say that, but there's a lot of it. I mean, geez. The thing I find interesting about them is they're, unlike us millennials, unlike you guys, Gen Xers, unlike the boomers, they are really the first generation that can be entirely self-made with very little effort, because this influencer movement. So when I was going to university 15 years ago, when I started going to university, this kind of this idea of doing art, like Brad and I studied philosophy together, this idea of doing humanities or art was a really precarious idea, you know, and it had been a precarious idea since the Renaissance, that, you know, if you are going to study art or philosophy or the humanities or something that isn't technically that available to capitalism, let's say, something that's, you know, not instant marketable or not instantly profitable, or there's a huge risk, you know. So when I was a teenager, not 15 years ago, my parents were like, please don't do this, please, you know. And I was like, no, I'm gonna make it, I'm gonna be an artist. Now the thing is, I do have friends that made it in music and art, but they're few and far between, and they were less than 1% of us. And the influencer generation is really fascinating to me, because from the age of 15, 16, they had a social media technology wherein they could put their own creations there to a mass audience, you know. Whereas the steps we took for a mass audience was get your first job, do an internship, hope for the, one day maybe you'll make it to TV, less than one and one. For that kind of exposure to be at their fingertips is for me like mind blowing, and so completely different to what it was a decade ago. And my art's only started to make opportunities in my late 20s, early 30s, and I have friends, some of my cousin is 23, and she had 100,000 followers on her art by 29. And I mean, by 19, I couldn't at 29 compete with that, because digital agencies will go on Instagram and flood all that up, And in a way, it's absolutely destroyed the art market in some ways for independent millennial makers, really. But I just wanted to
my heart breaks for the millennials and all the youth who are passing them by. No.
Well, we're not that young anymore.
I know.
That's the reality. The youngest of us is 26.
That does not make me feel better. Yeah. That does not make me feel better to know you guys aren't that young anymore. No, I hear you.
But my question was going to be, do you think there's been an acceleration like I do?
An acceleration? Well, yes. It's certainly been a massive change. I don't know if I don't think it's easy to say that there are many, many more opportunities now for younger artists than there were for artists in even my generation. I think there are some more. But you can squeak out a living at the bottom level maybe a little more easily if you're willing to do that. And if you have to come from a middle class background to be willing to take that risk, probably, I think. But what I would say is that when I was coming up as a writer, the aim was you sell some short stories.
Yeah.
You get the attention of a New York publisher, you write some novels, and then you become big enough to make a living from that. And then if you're really lucky, you'll get a couple of movies made out of your books, right?
Yeah.
And very few people really did that, but even the first step was difficult. It took me years to get a professional short story sold. I was 29 or 28 when my first short story sold to a glossy national publication. And shortly after, not that long after that I got a book contract, but it was a while. It was 99 when my first short story sold. It was 2007 when I sold my novel to Macmillan. And then Macmillan, the book came out and it didn't do huge, and the economic crisis happened, and I started podcasting. And I've had more success as a podcaster and on my own than I have through traditional publishing. I've done both, but I make my living now by running an imprint and doing creative work to promote that imprint, along with picking out the books that will get published. It's not the dream that I had when I was setting off to be a writer, but it's in the field, and it's because of using podcasts, YouTube.
Can you imagine back in your teens and 20s though, with Reddit and with Tumblr and with
when I was in my teens, my friends and I would get together and we'd use one of their dad's VHS recorders, and we'd make little shows, and then we'd show them to our friends.
I did that when I was a kid
too. Yeah, if we had been around today at that age, we would certainly have been putting it up on YouTube.
Yeah.
Right.
TikTok.
Or TikTok. TikTok is really, I find that really alienating, TikTok. Although I have a TikTok, but I can't imagine really trying to do. I mean, it's like the Twitter of video, I guess, or something like that. But anyway.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We just lost everything.
Okay, so.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask? About anything really.
Who did we lose?
We lost all our lights went out, and then we lost sound for a second.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I hope that answer wasn't too depressing, but it is like the reality of being a artist or a creator of content today is that it's highly competitive. Younger people have an advantage in some ways to older figures. On the other hand, though, if you got in early, you can have an empire. You know, if you're really early, you've got a lot of traffic going your way by now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I just see it as so different, so fast. It's just so funny. It's fascinating to me, and it's completely changed the modes of operation and the modes of like how capitalism operates with the humanities, politics, you know, revolutionary. I mean, I was in Occupy LSX 10 years ago, and we were running Tent City University. And just even from now till then, it's mad. Like just the changes of how accessible they have for how much accessibility they have for information and how much ability they have to deliver their own information. I find it fascinating. And where money is made too now as well, and how that's kind of rechanged the way that you earn money as an artist now is quite different. 10 years ago, you know, internships, rotoscoping, animation studios, I did all that. Well, and now, you know, it's the emphasis is really on self-production. It's all
right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I'm running up against as we're running our YouTube channel for Zero Books.
Yeah.
Like there are competing interests. Like we have all these really great writers putting out books through our imprint. And the aim is to create a platform where every really good author can take a moment to step forward onto that platform and be seen by our audience, right? But our audience doesn't click on author produced content from new people because they formed a parasocial relationship with me. So my content does better. And so like, I'm trying to think, well, how do I make this platform that's really designed for a singular person, you know, and parasocial relationships as a social media platform and make it work for a book imprint. And it's been tricky. And also when you're working with a lot of people around the globe producing video, the quality of the video fluctuates a lot.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, and, you know, it is a neoliberal kind of phenomenon that everyone's the self-produced, everyone is an entrepreneur of the self.
Yeah.
The arts are not, you know, if you're to be an artist, you have to create a parasocial bond with a group of fans.
Yep.
Rather than institutional support that includes a group of critics and other artists. Yeah. That just changes the direction of your art. Yeah.
Madness.
But nonetheless, everyone should go and support us on Patreon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can see me every week. And I love each and every one of you. You're my friends.
Sort of about what you were saying before, about how competitive is now. I think that what also comes with that is that as it is competitive and there's so much going on, it's so easy to just not pay people right for their work as well. Like, for example, it's so easy to do something that when someone asks, okay, do you want to do this for me, this job, this thing? It's easy to say, okay, I will do it for much less than the original normal rate for something like that is. And so rates for things in art goes really down. And I think new artists struggle a lot with basically financially because of that. It's so hard to, with so much art and so much different content around, to be able to, you know, there's always someone that's going to do it for less, sort of thing. Available, very available. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, back in 2009 or 10, for the first podcast I did called Diet Soap, which what a great name that was. I interviewed the cinematographer and editor for a film called Nikoi Katsi, which is part of the Koyaanisqatsi trilogy. And the guy who worked with Godfrey Reggio on that film worked in advertising. Like he tried to find a fine artist to do the editing and computer work and found that it wasn't working. This was back in 2002 when this film came out. And so I interviewed the advertising exec and creator about Nikoi Katsi. But what we talked about was the changing nature of advertising. And he said that it was difficult for him as a independent ad exec, with a little company, to get to do really good work and get really good clients, because now any 20-year-old or 19-year-old with a laptop could create pretty polished video and and do it cheap. And that, so even in the realm of advertising, corporate advertising, there was basically there were people who were creators were suffering from lower wages, basically, because of the technology being so readily available to so many different people and to younger people. So it's like, yeah, that's why we're all pushed into the position, like working for someone else, doing creative work for someone else, rather than doing creative work for yourself as an entrepreneur and building an audience, is, a tough way to make a living, and even in the corporate sector. Yeah. And has been for over a decade.
I was going to say, I was actually a film student on that note, and even in 2008, 9, 10, there was huge discussion and fear around the introduction of DR, what is it, DRVC, the handheld camcorders. Because back then, they were this small, could fit in your hand. But about 2006, 2009, this small could fit in your hand, and we're almost taking over, and we're cheap as chips. And we're almost taking over the quality of HDR, right? Not HDR, sorry, traditional film, as in what the film studios used right up until the 2010s, most did. And even back then, that was a huge fear. I felt it in my lecturers. They were afraid, not just for themselves, but for us, how fast that was happening. I remember a lecture saying, it's still important to get to use, these old expensive film cameras. It's still important to learn how to use them, because you're not going to have a camera in your back pocket. And I was like, well, look now, like we all do. It's bad.
Yeah. And I use this phone some of the time to create videos that I put on YouTube. I also have a camera, an actual camera up above me, but yeah, it's and I don't actually shoot that much anymore. Once COVID hit, I stopped trying to shoot my own material, and I went back to found footage almost exclusively. But yeah, I went to the Telluride Film Festival in, I don't know, like 92 or somewhere around there, around the time The Double Life of Veronica came out. And I remember hearing one of the filmmakers just extol the virtues of cheap video cameras and saying what a great revolution this was going to be for independent video and movie making, and how it was already great. And also the expanded array of cable channels was going to be a great boon for independent producers. And it didn't take long, I guess, for what would have been like something that could develop as an underground, counter-cultural, small boutique kind of economic model for a variety of creators, to instead, as the technology got better and better, to just sort of reduce the economy of the big picture, down, shrink it down. I mean, now we still do have major motion pictures that are multi-million-dollar projects, but they're all superhero movies, right? Or reruns of something that came before. And you have that, and then you have Netflix. Indies, I guess. Yeah. And now that's going to slowly fade away as Disney Plus destroys the streaming world.
Not yet. I don't think. Hopefully.
I was at the supermarket yesterday with my 18-year-old son, and we're standing in line for the self-checkout, and the guy, and we're looking at the Halloween display, and at the top of the Halloween display are a bunch of baby Yodas. The guy in front of us says, "Look at all that cheap plastic. I'm a garbage man, and I can tell you all of that cheap plastic after Halloween is going to end up in the dump. And it's terrible. We shouldn't buy that stuff, and we shouldn't throw it away." And I said, "You're absolutely right. I completely agree with you about the Halloween decorations. But if all of the baby Yodas in America were thrown in the dump, it would make my heart sing. And he just looks at me like, what? And I said, he says, I like Baby Yoda. And I said, we have profound religious differences. And my son was just like, oh my God, why did I go to the grocery store with my father?
Is there also an element of like, I suppose, the decentralization of the factory, that when we become entrepreneurs, we've no longer got sort of unions in the same kind of conventional way to force sort of bargaining power to raise wages in the same kind of, so there's an element that it's not simply just about technology, it's about how the social relations are kind of.
Right, but the thing about the intellectual worker, is that it's never been about commodity production, but about property relations. So to really think it through, you'd have to, off the top of my head, I can't outline all the differences, but it's about intellectual property and the centralization of the creation of intellectual property creates just a mass of money. And when you decentralize that, it just diffuses it out. And it does, I think it turns everyone into like little capitalists. Unlike workers who still are workers, are just workers for lower wages. It's like now we're all, it's more obvious that we're not, that the intellectual worker is a property holder. A landlord.
Intellectual property is a really interesting discussion now too. I should shut up because it's like 9:30 and I've just got so many things in my head now. But it's such an interesting thing too. I was reading Reddit the other day, kind of joined Reddit over lockdown, and then I regretted it because it's just extremely addictive. But I was, just looking up topics in my life that I'm quite interested in. And the things that people share there without any kind of intellectual property whatsoever. You've got kids sharing essays. When I say kids, university students sharing well-written philosophy essays and what they think about, Marx and this and that. And I just think, wow, it's interesting how laid back they are about that compared to how we were taught in school when it came to being very careful where you published your papers and being very careful where you uploaded your art and being very aware of property and intellectual property. And I find that really interesting how much of that has changed. And to come back to the lady in the pub, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Oh, me.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that when you said in some ways it's harder now. I think it was always harder to be paid properly for your work when you were starting out. At least I found that 10 years ago. But I think maybe a lot of what's harder as well is with this intellectual property thing being completely watered down by the nature of the fact that the internet is now absolutely saturated with creators, like saturated. And so there's always going to be someone who can do it cheaper, and it's always going to be easier to access them anyway. But that's all anyway. Sorry to throw that in, but I find that really fascinating as well. That really has changed society and the monetarial worth of art. And I don't just mean art as in pictures, art as in film, as in writing, as in music. It really has changed the worth of it at a really, really deep, fascinating level, or it is in the process of changing.
Well, I've enjoyed this. I feel like I should go pretty soon here, but I've enjoyed this conversation. I think that it was really interesting how it turned towards practical considerations for artists and creators and content producers at the end, because let's face it, on a person by person level, that is what we're all up against at the moment, right? It seemed to me that everyone here is some sort of artist or creator, and it's a precarious time, and there is no, there's never been a clear path, but there's not just, the path forward is all about creating until you drop, producing and producing and producing until you can't produce anymore, because if you don't keep feeding the the attention economy, you're going to get swept behind.
True.
I know this personally because I've gone through a kind of personal crisis and stopped for a little while or slowed down, and things stopped growing. It mattered.
Yeah.
Mm.
All right,
Well,
I'm
thanks so
going
much
to
for-
say goodbye.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, Doug. Been great.
All right,
Thank you. Bye.
thank you.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Exploding Appendix. Ideas and culture with guts.